Okay, 11:30. Yeah. Good morning. My name is Sharon Conley. I'm with the seminar committee. My husband and I are recent UCG members. It's my honor today to introduce Paul Pritchard. He is uniquely qualified for talking about this subject. So he will tell you more about that. He wants to talk about the futility of war, what it really cost, and the fact that we really need to be thinking about other options in this day and age where war is going on always at different areas all around the globe. So, by the way, also, Paul is my spouse. He is my husband. So we're happy to be here today.
You, Sharon, thank you very much. And by the way, Sharon was very helpful in putting this presentation together. I typically do not like to read comment speeches, so I'm going to give you my presentation largely just by looking you in the eye, and because this is an issue that we need to all be thinking about and be concerned about. 3 days ago, David Ignatius stole my thunder. He is a commentator, a columnist with the Washington Post, and Sharon gave me this, and I just was amazed at how much he and I, and I'm sure many of you are thinking on the same wavelength. I'm going to just read you 3 statements that he made. At the dawn of 2024, we should recognize that violence is raging over our planet, and the mechanisms to prevent it are failing badly. He goes on to say, the folly of war is the belief that it can solve problems. And then later he said, the biggest national security question for 2024 and beyond is how to craft the mechanisms that would actually combat the spread of war. Very insightful. And as I said, I've been working on this issue for some time, and I was so pleased that he had articulated it so well. What I want to do is talk about why we have war. And I also want to talk about how the effects it has, the price it has on humanity for us today. So with that said, let me using our high tech, I'm going to be learning how to use this. It's important to understand that war has always been part of the human condition. Unfortunately, it is something that has grown from cultures and civilizations, and only when conflict is fought by nations does it actually take on the term war. Basically, it's a conflict. And that issue, anthropologists have studied for some time and have come to a lot of interesting conclusions. They've been studying why is there war? Why do we have it? And what do we do about it? This is my book, which I wrote about my experience in Vietnam. This is not a book promotion time. I just brought it along because I thought you'd be interested in knowing that, as some psychiatrists say, once you're a warrior, always a warrior. And for a lot of us who have been in war, we're dealing with PTSD issues and so forth. And fortunately, it's something that is now recognized. It wasn't for the World War I shell shock warriors, as you may have had family members who suffered from that. But war is a condition, a mindset that warriors carry with them throughout their entire life. And several of my friends who are here were with me in Vietnam also. I was a graduate of the Industrial War College, which is a very sophisticated part of the military's education program, in which they try and help you understand why we do what we do, the warriors, the armies, so forth. I'm also a retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, I've studied and worked on issues as broad as the subway system in Moscow, which just shows you how much information we're all looking at, warriors, that is. And I also have been a career conservationist. I was the president of the National Parks and Conservation Association. I was one of President Carter's chief staff people working in the Department of Interior. Finally, I was the founder of the Climate Institute, which is in a way a metaphor for war. The two biggest issues that we're facing today are the whole global warming, climate change, and the issue of war. The only difference is war 2024 could be a major turning point where climate change is moving very quickly, but not in 1 year. I thought I would read you one quote from my book. It's a statement that I found many people seem to relate to. If there was a baptism in Vietnam, and most people think of a baptism by fire, but it wasn't by fire. It was from the humid, dusty, sun-dried wash of the helicopters mixed with the sweaty uncertainty of living and dying. And that's the introduction to my book. War is a period of uncertainty for warriors and a time in which it gives you a lot to think about as you are there doing someone else's bidding. Well, let's talk about war, because you really need to understand what war is before you can deal with how to solve the issues, as David Ignatius said, and as our minister talked about this morning. Very timely. Her sermon and my comments seem to be tied together, I think. War evolved, actually, anthropologists think, from the time in which mankind developed agriculture. Agriculture seemed to bring people together in communities. Those evolved into civilizations, to nations. And that's when people began to covet what others wanted. They wanted the food. They sometimes needed the food. Still to this day, that's an issue. Water, minerals, slaves, land, and anything else that they particularly wanted to have in their control over in their society. So that is the basis for conflict and for war. The Egyptians were the ones who first articulated a rationale for war. Number one, the Pharaoh was God. The Pharaoh spoke for when war declared war, and it was God speaking. It wasn't just the political leader, although later it was the political leaders that have been the major source of war. And God wanted the Egyptians to preserve their nation, and that's what every Egyptian thought, and understandably so. And also to increase their resources, increase their wealth. So that rationale is the first documented concept of why we have war, even though it existed for some time beyond that. Westmoreland, who was my leader in Vietnam, said it another way, though, and that is that it was really not the military that didn't start wars. It is, in fact, politicians who start wars. And that comes back to us time and time again as you study the history of wars throughout time. The politicians, sometimes those are the kings, sometimes those are the popes, sometimes those are religious leaders, but whoever leads the people, those are the people largely you can look at who are the source of instigating the war. The first modern day Christian articulation of war was by Bishop Augustine of a town called Hippo in North Africa. And he talked about a just war. It had two elements, and so we'll want to discuss those two elements. First, when can you have the right to go to war? And he discussed that. And the second is, then what is the right conduct that you should have as a warrior and as political figures? And we'll track that concept down through this very day. Today, that concept of right conduct is an important issue and one that's never really been solved. Today, the concept of just war, the first concept of of Augustine, was well articulated by Murray Rothbard, a famous economist, who wrote up the following summary of, and I'm trying to stay out of your way if you if I'm in your way, let me know. A just war exists when a people try to ward off the threat of coercive domination by another people, or to overthrow an already existing domination, simply stated. And contrary, a war is unjust, on the other hand, when a people try to impose domination on another people or try to retain an already existing coercive rule over them. And that is the terminology that military strategists and others, that definition is largely the one that's used to this very day. Now we're going to do a case study very quickly, but since this is one that I have experience with, this is the experience with Vietnam. And I'm going to tell you about three theories that were relevant to the decision by the United States, beginning with President Eisenhower, to go to war in Vietnam. This is North Vietnam. This is South Vietnam. Cambodia, Thailand, Laos. This is Burma. This is a French map, and so you get French terminology here. The first theory that was used quite quickly, easily accepted, was the domino theory. The idea that the Chinese and the Russians, who supported Ho Chi Minh, wanted to be able to expand the influence of communism. And so the domino theory was, we take Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh is committed to taking over South Vietnam, so we will fight or support him to take over this area, and then we'll be able to take over all of Southeast Asia. That was one theory. The second theory was more relevant to what I said earlier, and that was the rice bowl theory. China, during this time, many of you may know, had very little food. Millions of people were dying. This is called the rice bowl of Asia, and is probably the most productive rice producing area of its magnitude anywhere in the world. To control the rice bowl by China would have given them incredible power to grow and to expand communism and their other philosophies. The third theory is one that I've sort of come up with, and that is the religious theory. The people of Vietnam were under the French for over 100 years, and that many of them adopted the Roman Catholic faith. When the separation of Vietnam occurred, North Vietnam was primarily a Buddhist area. South Vietnam was primarily Roman Catholic. And the conflict between the Roman Catholic and the Buddhist in this area was quite significant and resulted in, you may remember, the Buddhist monks, in some cases, burning themselves to death. And this was a common dilemma in the South, the conflict between the Roman Catholic and the Buddhist. Really more of a cultural conflict than a religious conflict, but I think they're probably one and the same. Those three theories were the basis for our involvement in Vietnam. And before I go to the issue of right conduct, which was very relevant during Vietnam, let me just say the question that you should be asking yourself about that war then was it worth the 58,288 deaths of American soldiers and the millions of Vietnamese who died and still are suffering from Agent Orange and other issues? Was it worth the $1 trillion in today's dollars? And that wasn't just during that period in which the war was fought. Every year, the federal government spends $20 billion on medical assistance for veterans who fought in Vietnam. Every year, $20 billion that could go for other public services, needs, or just, if you are conservative, reduction of taxes. But that is the cost, the price of war. In fact, we'll go into a little bit more detail in just a minute. The second part of St. Augustine's theory was, of course, just conduct. Socrates gave it a rationale which was very simple. You can't live in peace if you don't fight wars. The interesting thing about Socrates, who was a warrior, was that his theory allowed for the total destruction, annihilation of the enemy. The Manu, an Indian code, Hindu origin, changed that and had more emphasis on human concerns of the people. That is, first you try to negotiate and reconcile differences. And if that doesn't work, then you have responsibility during the war to deal with the problems that the soldiers might have, the harming of civilians, of non-combatants, of so forth, and even the use of force that is appropriate. Hippo was very concerned about this use of force and the appropriate, and he did discuss the idea of dealing with the treatment of captives, but also the types of weapons that one should deal with. Now, isn't this interesting? A Catholic bishop, and if you remember during that time, there wasn't a pope. The bishops were the leaders of the Catholic faith, and they would argue among themselves and eventually ended up having one bishop become the pope. So what you have is a bishop who was very respected, very prominent, coming up with the concept to justify war and the behavior that you should have if you are fighting a war. Interestingly enough, to bring it up to date, President Lincoln was very much concerned about the conduct of the Civil War soldiers. And a law professor, devised a set of standards called the Labor Code, in which Lincoln adopted, which said soldiers should respect civilians, should respect the wounded, and other conduct rules. Interestingly, almost at the same time, a private citizen, a Swiss man, was traveling across Europe right after a major war had been inflicted in a certain part. And so all the soldiers, many of them dead, many of them still in pain and agony, left on the battlefield. He went back to Switzerland and he said, we should not allow this to happen if we're going to have wars. And so what he did was he created the philosophy of citizen that led to the establishment of the Red Cross and the Geneva Conventions, which are still important to this day. So the Geneva Conventions were developed by this one, Henri Dumont, and his thinking, not a prominent individual, but just a person who was concerned. And I say that because I want you to take that to heart and think about how you might be the one who helps come up with some way of dealing with conflict other than war. Well, these were efforts to deal with the second part of St. Augustine's theory of right conduct. But let's just talk about what is the price of war. Okay? Most military strategists only deal with basically short-term things such as the number of casualties, the number of collateral damage, as it's called, the amount of weapons that were needed, things like that. But there's a lot more to it that really has never been articulated, and I'm going to mention 9 issues. The first, of course, is the loss of lives, civilians, so forth. And I just want to use one example. As many of you know, the Battle of Stalingrad, you may not know, it was the deadliest battle of all history that we know of, in which an incredible number of people, 2 million people, died in a matter of days fighting the Germans and the Russians. A second major cost is the long-term disability of veterans. And I mentioned that $20 billion a year we spend just for the Vietnam veterans like myself. A third is the burden and stress on the military families. The families pay an incredible price. The families, not only because they're losing or they have a child that goes to war and may not come back, but if they don't come back, the consequences of that are significant for the rest of their lives. So this is a cost, a price that we pay. Then we have the national expense. Talk about money. Vietnam was over $1 trillion just in direct costs for that war. This was just World War I cost, 22 trillion. Imagine that. Not in today's dollars, that was in those dollars. And imagine how much was sacrificed by our nation, Great Britain, France, Russia, every one of the countries that was involved in this. These are all part of the price of war. And we go on to more important or other issues, the loss in each nation of their discretionary programs. Now, what are discretionary? Well, unfortunately, I use that term, but I'm talking about hospital care. I'm talking about education. I'm talking about all the various things that societies provide for their people, but unfortunately are not able to when they don't have the resources to provide that. If you were to talk about programs, many of you as educators would understand that, but the gross domestic product was reduced after World War I by as much as 40%. The capacity of the nation to do things for its people is another way of looking at that. 7 is one that we really haven't dealt with, but is occurring to this day. The Japanese people lost so many young men and so many people that their population may not really exist after the year 2050. It's a similar problem exists in Italy. So many deaths, so many people, the demographic consequences of war. And here we have in Russia 300,000 soldiers who died in the current Ukraine conflict. Just in Ukraine, 150,000 Ukrainians. And just in a matter of months, this war is not that long. I include the emotional toll of war. And what I mean by that is that especially there's a famous line that a friend of mine who was a historian focusing primarily on the Confederacy, and he said, the victors write the history, the vanquished write the songs. War has a consequence in which people who are the losers in any particular way are constantly dealing with and struggling with that. And I'll give you one example. How many people talk about Vietnam? We lost that war. And yet, and many people still feel the pain of why we participated in that war. And finally, this is the issue that I'm most concerned about. Global warming, climate change is a metaphor, in a way, for what's happening with war and what David Ignatius was talking about. He's saying in 1 year, there are so many conflicts around the globe that we may be struggling, we may be dealing with major destruction in this next year. Global warming is just one of the many issues that comes out from environmental alterations that occur because of the consequences of war. The loss of species, the loss of habitat, the loss of even good soils, all of those are affected dramatically by war. These are all the prices that are, I think, too much and are often ignored when we deal with war. Well, I've talked about this. I'm going to try. Can I finish up? Just two more slides, 3 more. You might say, well, what can we do about it? We're like lemmings. We're going to continue to go over the edge. We're going to continue to, or are we? Cultures in the past have actually looked for ways of avoiding war. I don't know whether you're aware of it. This is called a ball game the Mayans had. And if you notice these little circles on the wall are about as big as a basketball hoop. 2 teams would play. You can see all the people standing here to give you some idea of how high that is. Priests would stand up along the top, and they would try for days to get the 2 teams get a little hard ball through that ring. And whoever got it through that ring was the victor. And then the priest would make a determination on the issue of conflict. There are other consequences. For example, the losing team was killed. But at least in some cases, they avoided war. And that's one example of a culture trying to find a way to avoid war. The second is, of course, the warrior dances. You've probably heard of those. This is in New Guinea, where the soldiers, the men, will dance and face each other and stick out their tongue and do all sorts of things to say, you know, we're stronger, we're better, whatever. Sometimes until they're all exhausted, and then they go home. And that's the extent of their war. But sometimes they don't stop, and they do have a war experience. This is, though, true around the globe. In Africa, in Native America, Polynesians, all of them have ceremonial war dances. Another example of a society trying to find solutions. Conclusion, well, I think we all agree the price is not worth it. But are there alternatives? And who should be looking for those alternatives? The politicians won't, industry won't. Eisenhower made a very famous statement about the military-industrial the relationship between the military and the industry was feeding upon itself. But there was a person like Henri Dunant who, just because he saw the pain and suffering that occurred, led the battle, led the fight around the world to create not only the Red Cross, but also the convention which dealt with the amelioration of the wounded in the times of war. So I remind you of the issue of global warming And I think it is something which you and I need to realize, that we're as much responsible for solving that issue as we are in looking for alternatives for war. All of this said, I would just bring up one last statement. War settles nothing. And Eisenhower said it time and time again in different ways. David Ignatius quoted him again another way. Many people have said it, but that is the bottom line, the simplest way it can be said. It settles nothing. Now, I'd be happy to take any questions. And you might say, well, you've led us down this path and it's sort of dark. I have conceived at least one approach that I'm thinking might work as an alternative. And I'll be happy to discuss that if we have time, but I don't want to take all of your time here. But there are questions, please.
Yep, a comment. Could you come over and use the mic for that? So if you be picked up on that.
Yeah, I was gonna comment on that slide of yours with the what do you call it? Well, I was gonna add like maybe the generational toll of right, because of the children and the grandchildren and experiences after, you know, families go through war.
Mm-hmm.
And that so I just wanted to hear your comments on that. I mean, that could be one.
You're talking about the 9
Yeah.
cost of war. And I think it's an important point that you raised.
You could say family, right? I mean,
Yes.
family.
This is part of that, the burden and stress on military families, but also on society in general. And the consequences, some interesting books have been written, one by a physician who was in Vietnam and who continued on as a psychiatrist. And it's a fascinating book, which in a second, I'll remember the title, but it has to do with the once a warrior, always a warrior. But he also talks about the fact that warriors bring back from war the tensions, the stress, the mental problems that they oftentimes have. And that's one of the issues that we're finally dealing with. And that's why it's costing us $20 billion a year to deal with, through the VA, with the needs just of the Vietnam War veterans. But I encourage you to read that book if you have time, if you're interested in the details. Thank you for the question. Yes, sir.
I'm Ed Carter. I had just a comment. You know, you said war settles nothing, but war sells bullets. And it seems to me that a lot of, in some cases, it seems like the bullet companies are creating wars to sell their bullets. That seems like a different motivation for war than the ones that you mentioned. It doesn't solve anything, but it's selling it's a different kind of resource. Another thing is, it seems to me that instead of nations going to war nowadays, it's more like corporations. That there's sort of like oil corporations who are fighting for resources, or rare earth metals, or, you know, I hear about Shell starting wars in Africa, eliminating so the third thing is that war as a means of, you mentioned population control or demographic shifting, that some people, it seems like some wars are started to do that genocide type of event. So yeah, I don't
point.
What I guess my question is, how do you, if you're dealing with a nation, you know, you have a leader you can see, you have motivations you can understand. What if you're dealing with a corporation instead of a nation?
Good question. And I think let me first say that, the concept of corporate involvement, business involvement in war is unfortunately older than anyone that I know of has studied, but it's true. It was true with the British, what was called West Indies Company, that really was the dominant force in India, not the British government. And even to this day, where oil companies and other resource-oriented companies, the term banana republics has been a factor in the Central American countries, where banana corporations, oftentimes would get the U.S. involved in war. To the question of do we have, is there an alternative? Let me suggest to you, after looking at a number of things, the International Criminal Court, Court of Justice, the United Nations had several programs which were directed at trying to solve war. They, according, have failed, and so they are no longer in existence. But the ICJ and other groups that are mainly are effective in dealing with war criminals, as we saw with the battle in Yugoslavia, the leaders who were then the Serbians and so forth. But it isn't really a way of preventing war, which is really the issue that I think we're talking about. I would suggest to you that a concept which I'm going to try and come up with, and I welcome any input. Many of you know what binding arbitration is. When you buy a car, when you have a disagreement with a landlord. If the United Nations were to develop an approach in which all nations would agree that there would be a process of binding arbitration, which if two countries didn't agree, they would come forward and select an unbiased individual, just like you have in binding arbitration. And I say binding now, I'm not just saying arbitration. Now, you might say, well, what would keep those nations involved? Well, my concept is all the other member nations would agree that if that country didn't agree, didn't abide by the solution, they would discontinue trade and other activities with that nation for a period of 10 years. You might say, well, where do you come up with all this? Well, actually, the Athenians had a concept of this, which was the ostracism. You didn't die, you were sent away for 10 years. And that was their approach to dealing with those who didn't get along with others in their society. They were basically given the oyster shell. They were told that they were to leave, and they had to live outside the community for 10 years. And then they could come back. Well, the same concept could apply if we had a binding arbitration approach in which we said, all the nations said, look, for 10 years, we're not going to trade with you unless you accept what was resolved by that arbitrator. Anyway, it's a concept. I'm playing with it, but I would welcome your feedback. Please, you have a question?
Yes, yeah, I agree. Binding arbitration, that's an idea, but of course, we've seen that in a short term and a more limited scope with regard to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, for example, where many, many nations have put a lot of economic pressure on Russia. Also, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower talked about a lot exists, but it just is. Another thing, though, to be considered that people don't generally recognize, I think, is that Chris Hedges wrote about. He said, war is a force that gives us meaning. And we saw that after 9/11. I saw the invasion of Iraq as imminent as soon as the 9/11 attack occurred. And that's what happened. And it's because people in the US were inflamed by that. And the populace was fully behind the invasion of Iraq as a result.
Very good points. And I would mention that the one of the least effective tools has been the United Nations Security Council, which was supposed to stop those sort of conflicts, but which the several nations, Russia, United States, China, have always protected anyone who might have been isolated or whatever. And so the Security Council has become ineffective, totally ineffective. But your points are well taken. Yes, ma'am.
This is going to seem pretty simple and naive. However, I believe that our national anthem indicates pretty well who we are as a culture. It's all about war. And that runs so deep in who we are as a people. You know, probably one of the most sung songs that we have. Why don't we have America the Beautiful for our national anthem? I just wonder what impact that would have on who we are and how we feel about ourselves.
You see, you're doing what I'm suggesting we need, and that is starting to think about ways to turn around the pressure that we all feel when something happens like 9/11, and to have something that where we sing America the Beautiful. You're absolutely right. Well said. Thank you. Yes, please.
I have a thought going along that way of thinking about solutions is, I always, since high school, one of my sayings in my yearbook was to change is to grow. I think it was somebody, I'm not sure if it was Gandhi, but, and is that a way to deal with like wars differently, right? I mean, can you think of like chain, or turn? And one idea just to use technology like we do for a lot of things, for solving a lot of things. I mean, we have AI right now that can go into all the databases, data sets in the world, and instead of thinking about it as a negative solution for so many things that, I mean, it can be used for bad, but could it be used for good, and trying to come up with
State your point.
possible solutions in these, millions of trillions of databases that we have out there. Just my thought.
Very good point. And I would encourage you to think more about how that might work. I agree. And well, I think what the computers have done, and by the way, the computer systems, so forth, were developed by the military. Interesting twist of fate, but yes, and in all fairness, he was not American. But yes, Greg, you have to stand in front of the mic. I'm sorry.
I was going to say that governments have manipulated populations through lies. They did that with Vietnam, with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which never really happened. And Russia has done that with Ukraine. So combating lies, and it seems like our governments just accept lying as being accepting. But the price from lies is catastrophic.
Very interesting point. And weapons of mass destruction, remember that one in Iraq? That was another lie. And during World War II, which many, I would argue, was a just war, if you want to apply the concepts that we're talking about. But there was a tremendous amount of energy investment by our military in propaganda. in controlling the information flow. And one of the mistakes that the military strategists say that happened with Vietnam was not controlling the information flow, allowing people to see graphic presentations
Oh, yeah.
of what the consequences of war.
And they
And in
couldn't-
fact, as you may be aware, the camera was just developed at the time of our Civil War. And the pictures of the dead soldiers at Antietam and Gettysburg and so forth was very significant in influencing the final resolution of that war. So your point is well taken. There has to be some way for the people to get information that's honest and accurate. And that's part of the solution that I'm searching for, and I know you would also. Yes, David.
I'm David Wilkham, a Vietnam veteran, and I've counseled veterans for a number of years. Two comments that I would like to say on lessons learned that in some way the U.S. did get it right. And after World War II, they implemented what was called a Marshall Plan, where we actually helped rebuild Germany and I guess to some degree Japan, because we had learned that Germany, like you were saying, was so devastated after World War I. We didn't want the same thing happen when Hitler came to power and said we were treated unfairly and we have to right that wrong. And so I think that's one lesson that we learned where we did get it right. The second is that that we had a problem after World War I. We promised World War I veterans a bounty or a pension or some type of grant, and that was never appropriated after the war. And the World War I veterans from all over the country marched on DC, and they camped out just like you saw some of the other protesters today camp out. And their former commanding general, Pershing, cleared the wall and forced the veterans off the tent camps, which was very much of an embarrassment. And I think that's one of the reasons that the GI Bill and after World War II really tried to help veterans get back into society, because they saw what's the problem that can happen when you don't do that, as in World War I. Thank you.
Very, very good points. And I'd like to just reinforce your comment about the Marshall Plan. There were people in Truman's administration who said we should take everything away from the Germans, return them to an agrarian culture, destroy their industrial capacity, whatever. Senior people in his administration. And it was George C. Marshall, a general, who came up with the Marshall Plan, which I totally agree, I think has helped avoid conflict since the end of World War II, and should be part of any solution. There still is a demand for retributions, because those other nations that spent money fighting the World War I Axis, and in World War II, the same problems there. But it's an important solution. Part of the solution is how do we take care of the nations that are defeated, giving them some respect back, and how do we take care of the veterans? And repeatedly during the Civil War, during the Revolutionary War, we have not treated our soldiers with respect during and after the conflict. But that's another issue. Well, you've been a wonderful, very thought-provoking group. I appreciate your time. I hope you have one more question. You get the last one.
Yeah, for a solution is listen to the women.
You'd be interested in knowing only 8 women died in Vietnam. 58,200 men and 8 women, which just shows there's something that says Not that women weren't fighting, because there were a lot of nurses and others that we saw over there, and, but it was, maybe they were smarter. I don't know. But you're absolutely right. There are very few examples of women generals. There were some pharaohs, and there have been some other leaders who were women, but it's very rare. Unfortunately, it has been men. Thank you again. Have a great day. Next time, next Sunday, we have the